If you want to set your bike up for track days or racing or even sporty riding up the ranges, most people think about the most common things like chains and chain lubing and tyres and air pressures and servicing the bike and putting oil in it and things like that. But not everyone gives consideration to the brake fluid, and if you don't know anything about the brake fluid that's in your bike, you should replace it with a quality racing brake fluid. Now, which brake fluid do you actually choose? And that was the question that I went through recently, because what had happened was I bought a Beringer Thumb Brake from Al Samuels down there at Race Dynamics in Sydney. And he sent it up, and with it he also enclosed a bottle of brake fluid, which was Motul RBF 700. The RBF stands for racing brake fluid. Now, I already had RBF 600 and RBF 660, so my interest, was raised about why did he send me 700? So I thought I'd go and do some research and find out about the different types of brake fluids. This video is about that research we did, and I hope you find it interesting, because I think it might help you understand why you would choose different brake fluids over other brake fluids. I don't know if you've actually looked at the shelves on your local auto parts supplier or gone online and searched for brake fluids, but if you have, then you'd be familiar with the idea that there's just this tremendous range of choices. And how do you actually know which one to choose? So my interest in this was sparked, as I said, when I received a bottle of RBF 700 from my mate Al Samuels down in Sydney. So I did some research, and this video is basically what I found in that research. Now, when you buy a brake fluid, what you'll get is like what you see on the screen. It's going to be a brake fluid container that's going to have a reference on it, and that reference is in the form of dot and then a number. So in this particular case, you've got dot 4. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, there's a range of these. Now, first of all, DOT stands for the Department of Transportation, which is a US-based organisation, and they basically govern the standards associated with fluids, such as brake fluids. Now, we adopt that in Australia, as do many other countries. Not every country would adopt those standards, I would say, but we adopt those here. Now, the number itself also gives you an indication of the properties of this particular fluid, and those numbers range from 3.4.5.5.1, and they indicate the properties and performance characteristics of the fluid. Now, dot 3 is a lower performing fluid than dot 4, and dot 4 lower performing than 5, and 5.1, and so on. So they kind of just climb that scale of performance characteristics. An important point about these different fluids, dot 5, which is not usually used in motorcycles, is a silicon-based fluid. It's not suitable for the systems that we have in motorcycles, and I've never seen a silicon-based fluid put into a motorcycle. So it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but I'm not aware of it. Now, silicon-based fluids, dot 5, will not mix with dot 3, 4, and 5.1 because they're glycol-based fluids. Now, the difference between these two fluids is not only that the systems need to be set up separately or differently. A glycol-based fluid is prone to absorbing moisture or water, whereas silicon-based fluids has a higher or different characteristics. I think it's called hygroscopic, the characteristic of it to absorb water. So silicon seems to resist that water absorption. Now, we're going to work or focus on dot 3, 4, and 5.1. Now, the fluids that I actually looked at are all from the Motul brand. The ones we looked at is dot 4, RBF 600, 660, and 700, which are all dot 4 incidentally, and then dot 5.1. We simply got the information directly from Motul, and this is a breakdown of those things. Now, when you're studying the characteristics of these different brake fluids and you want to understand which one you would choose, then in essence, there's only two things we look at. There's boiling temperature and then there's viscosity. And the boiling temperature we look at when it's dry, and that is pure brake fluid, and then wet boiling point. And wet boiling point is when they introduce moisture into the brake fluid, and I think it's about 3.7% water introduced to the brake fluid, and they then measure the boiling point of that. And that's important because glycol-based fluids absorb water, and the boiling temperature or the boiling point of the fluid decreases as we introduce water, which has a lower boiling temperature. boiling point, I should say. Now, viscosity is looked at two different temperature ranges, or two different temperature points. Minus 40 degrees Celsius, you would expect the fluid to be thicker at that level, and then viscosity at 100 degrees Celsius. So, looking at these motul fluids and the data that we dug out, Dot 4 has a dry boiling point of 245 degrees Celsius. Dot 5.1 has a dry boiling point of 272 degrees Celsius. Now, RBF 600, 660 and 700s are all racing brake fluids, so you would expect them to perform better under extreme conditions, including increased temperatures. And that's actually true. RBF 600 has a dry boiling point of 312, 660 is 328 degrees Celsius, and 700 is 336. So if you're looking for a fluid that performs under extreme temperatures, then, like racing, the rear brake of a high-performance motorcycle where the brake is going to, be used quite excessively at high speed for hard braking, then RBF 700 would probably be the right type of fluid for those conditions because it has a higher boiling point under those conditions. Now, the second performance characteristic is wet boiling point. And you'll notice, and it's interesting to see that wet boiling point for Dot 4 is 160 degrees, Dot 5.1 is 185 degrees. And like we said earlier, 4 isn't as high a performing fluid as 5.1, and that's indicated by both the dry boiling point and wet boiling point. But what's interesting is RBF 600, 60 and 700 actually have a higher boiling point when under wet conditions. 204 degrees for the 600 and 660 and 205 degrees for the 700. So they're generally going to perform better in more humid conditions or in wetter conditions, such as in, marine type applications or something like that. Now, the other thing, actually in the screenshot here, you see we've combined these. The highest performing fluid there in regards to boiling temperature, wet and dry conditions is RBF 700, as you would expect. Then the next one is 660, then 600. Then we go to 5.1 and then down to Dot 4. So there you go. Those are the boiling temperatures. Now, the second thing we spoke about was viscosity, and I just nearly went off my brain trying to work out the viscosity metric because there's a number of these. The one that we actually are referring to here is square millimeters per second, and it's really weird because square millimeters is not a measure of volume, but this is the metric that is actually used to measure viscosity. But in short, what you've got on here are the numbers that are associated with the viscosity at two temperatures. Minus 40 degrees Celsius, where you would expect it to be thicker, and then at 100 degrees Celsius, where you would expect the fluid to be thinner. As it heats up, it gets thinner. And what we can extract from this particular fluid here, or this particular chart here, is that the Dot 5.1 is the best performing fluid in cold temperatures. So at minus 40 degrees Celsius, it is not as thick from a viscosity perspective as the other fluids. The fluids that get thicker at those higher temperatures are the RBF 600, 660 and 700s. So those fluids there are probably not the right fluids that you would utilize in extremely cold conditions. So if you were operating, down in the southern tip of Tasmania or something like that, then they're probably not the right fluid. The fluid that's going to give you the best performance in the really cold temperatures from a viscosity perspective is going to be Dot 5.1. Now, at the higher temperatures, you'll notice that Dot 5.1, right, is not as thin as RBF 700. RBF 700 is actually the thinnest fluid at 100 degrees Celsius. And then the other ones are slightly thicker. The thickest fluid at 100 degrees Celsius is actually RBF 660. So the viscosity level at the thinner level, at the higher temperature level, actually matters as well, because what it means to us is the flow rate is going to be lower the higher the viscosity. So the bigger the number there, the thicker the fluid is, then the lower the flow rate through the machinery or the mechanism that it's actually pumping through. The flow rate is higher for the thinner material. So we're going to get this high performance at high temperatures with the thinner material in the RBF 700 and the DOT 5.1. Now, another part of this is relates to viscosity, and that is heat transfer. The thicker the fluid, the less capable it is in transferring heat through the fluid and away from the point of heating. The thinner the fluid, then the better the heat transfer. So in higher temperatures, extremely high temperatures, then you can see here that RBF 700 is probably the choice of the fluids here. But if you're operating in super cold temperatures, DOT 5.1 is actually going to be, from a viscosity perspective, a better fluid to operate with. Now, why wouldn't you choose DOT 5.1? Because that is a lower boiling temperature than RBF 700. So, my bias would be towards that RBF 700. So, at the end of the day, choosing the right one, it's going to depend very specifically on your needs, the performance characteristics you have to impose on the fluid, whether you're in super cold conditions or you're out there racing and putting the the brakes under extreme braking conditions and heating them up to super high levels. So there you go. Hope that was useful. That's it from me. I'll see you on track. Bye.